Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study this morning. We're going to continue in the Gospel of John, chapter 6 today, verses 16 to 24. It's about Jesus walking on the water. It's interesting. I say that every week, but it's only because it's true. Let me read verses 16. Let's get right on into it. Let me read verses 16 to 21 in chapter 6. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about, they're in a boat and they're rowing. They have no motor. They're rowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then verse 21. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. All right. That's basically the whole episode, but there's another section of scripture we're going to study in addition to that finishes out that section. Now there's some differences to these scriptures with the same event that we find in Mark 6 verses 45 to 56. There they saw Jesus coming toward them, walking on the water, and they were terrified there too because they thought that he was a ghost. All right. Jesus was about to pass them by when he, in the version of Mark, or the description in Mark, Jesus was about to pass them by. He was walking on the water. He was about to pass them by when they called to him. Now, I never really got an adequate answer as to why he is going to pass them by. It seems to me that he was going to the other side of the lake, of course, and he only went to them when they showed that they needed him to assuage their fear. Now their fear was not necessarily from the storm there. It looked to me like it was because they thought they had seen a ghost. Now we're going to be drawing on the version we find in Mark today as we go through this version in John. So let me read verses 16, we're back in John chapter 6. Let me read verses 16 and 17 again, just to kind of regroup. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. All right, when evening came. It is the evening of the day of the feeding of the 5,000 families. We studied that. Just a great picture of Jesus giving a sign that he is the Messiah. They got in the boat and left with Jesus. Mark 6:45 says Jesus sent them had sent them on already, while he dismissed the crowd. All right, now that's what Mark says. It was dark. Mark said that they left under instructions from Jesus, meaning Jesus sent them on ahead, because he had planned, had dismissed the crowd, but he had planned to go into the hills to pray after he dismissed the crowd. And we may be going back to look at that, but at the appropriate time, we'll be going back over there. Okay, so that's the wrap up of the feeding of the 5,000. He sent the disciples on ahead. It was late in the day, evening. He sent the disciples on ahead while he dismissed the crowd. He didn't go with them because he had intended to go on into the hills to pray. Let's look at verse 18. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. rough water. Mark 6:48 says the wind was against them, meaning the waves were coming into them. Now notice I already read that they were rowing a boat, and it's just like running or walking or swimming or anything. If you're going into the wind, you're going to have a harder time. If you happen to be in a boat going into the wind, the waves are coming into you, and your boat is always the bow is always going to be going up and down as it goes over the wakes caused by the wave. So it can be a scary time in a boat in deep water for sure, particularly at night. Apparently this was an east to west wind, which was the worst direction for the wind on Lake, I think this is Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee. Sam Rayburn is a lake in Texas. It's the largest man-made reservoir in the state. Jan and I vacationed down there lots of times, and we have seen many storms there. But there was one particular time the wind was different, and the water could be seen coming into the bank in 4 rows of waves. You just get seemed like 4 rows of waves hitting the bank, a little lull, and you get 4 more, and it would just kind of building on itself. Everybody has stories about storms on the lake. But here the Bible says the water grew rough as measured by a bunch of people who made their living in boats. These guys are fishermen, so they know water, they know boats, and they know storms, and they know storms on the lake. All right. There was another water miracle which we're aware of, which was the parting of the Red Sea. Now, this may seem like I'm diverging for a bit, but I'm really not. There, the Creator parted the sea to redeem his people from the hand of Pharaoh. You remember Moses had gone under God's direction to lead the people out of Egypt. They had been in slavery there for 400 years, and God said it's time for them to go, and he sent Moses to do that. Now, they ended up, Pharaoh relented. He was going to come mow them down out there in the wilderness, and he finally caught up with them when they had run into the Red Sea. Their backs were up against the sea. There was nowhere to go because you got the deep water ahead of them, and you got Pharaoh and his troops coming behind them. So it looks like all is going to be lost. But we know the story. God parts the Red Sea. Now, we've talked about Jesus as the Son of God, as Messiah, and God himself being in control of nature. Now, I want us to understand what that really means. We could say, I want to flip over to Psalm 77. Speaking of the Red Sea miracle, we've always said that Jesus could just speak and the storm would quiet, and that is definitely a show of power over nature. If you could just speak it, say, simmer down, and the weather just simmers down. It is obviously a show of power. But I want you to read this. We're going to read some of this psalm as it pertains to the Red Sea miracle. Psalm 77, verses 16 and verse 19 and 20. Verse 16. Now, get the picture. I've already said it once. I want to say it again. The Israelites were there with their backs up to the Red Sea. They can't swim it. It's too far to swim. They can't walk it. It's too deep. And they can't go back because Pharaoh's army is there. So they're just kind of standing there thinking it's, going to be bad for them. But you know what happened? Moses, under God's direction, raised his hands and the seas parted. Now, Listen to this. Psalm 77, verse 16. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. In verse 19 and 20, your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. That said, now we know that it was not Moses that parted the Red Sea, it was God. God told him, Moses went out there, raised his hands and held them up, and the seas parted. But I want you to understand really what happened. Psalm 77 says the sea saw God. And because he saw God, because the sea saw God, it just parted. It just knew what to do. That's the kind of power we're talking about that God has over nature. He doesn't even have to command it. It just knows God and what is required for the moment. And I think that's what it said. It said the water saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. And then it says there was a path made for everybody, for them to, but your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. It just saw God and knew what he wanted. Now we're going to be talking about Jesus here in a minute, about his power over nature. God as creator controls nature, and does whatever he wants and whenever he wants. So here is the situation with the Red Sea. Now let's go forward back to John in verse 6, verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 and 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. They were pretty far out when they saw Jesus coming toward them, walking on the water. This is the place in Mark where he says Jesus was about to pass them by. Furthermore, they were terrified. And what were they terrified of? Jesus or the storm? It's pretty clear that the main reason for the fear was seeing Jesus walking on the water. They thought he was a ghost, because, who does that? Must have been a ghost, right? So let's look at verse 20. But he said to them, or they were frightened, but he said to them, it is I, don't be afraid. He delivers them from their fear by being present with them. Saw him approaching the boat, but he identified himself. They thought he was a ghost, but he identified himself. It's me. He said, it's I. He delivers them from their fear by being present with them. His presence in our lives should be enough to alleviate our fears of all kinds and at all times. And that's a tall statement. It's a big ask, but that's what faith is all about. And we're supposed to trust him for that. But he makes another revelation of who he is when he identifies himself. He says, it is I. It could be just an identification. He could just be identifying himself. But this is the same as saying I am, since there is no predicate. Predicate is something to complete the meaning. That's not there. So what the Greek reduces to is to the same thing as saying I am. Exodus 3 verses 14 to 15 is where that first appeared. Let's flip over there and look at it. Exodus 3. This was Moses when he met God at the burning bush. Exodus 3 verses 14 and 15. God said to Moses, well, what happened was Moses said, when I go to the Israelites, who am I supposed to tell them sent me? He says, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. God says in verse 15, he says, God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me. This is my name forever. The name you shall call me from generation to generation. I need to just reiterate that. This is what he told Moses at the burning bush. He said, this is my name, and it's my name forever. It's to be passed on from generation to generation to generation. This is no small thing. So to Jesus, it was a sign of messiahship, not a miracle. When he said, it is I, he was saying, I am. All right, let's look at verse 21. Then they were willing to take him to the boat, into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. Not much to report here, except they took up Jesus on his offer of redemption. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid, when they took him into the boat. So Jesus, again, is fulfilling the role of God of feeding, of protecting, of rescuing, of guiding those who call on him. They called on him. Another occurs, which is very important. Mark says the storm subsided. I want to go look at that. We didn't really do what I said we were going to do. We really didn't go over there and look at it, but I want to look at this. Yeah, Mark 6. Let's start with 51. No, 50 and 51. In verse 50, because they saw him and were terrified, immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Don't be afraid. In verse 51, then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. That goes back to me. It goes back to that psalm that I read to you. The same thing happened at the Red Sea. The storm saw Jesus, and it doesn't say that he did anything here, I don't think. It just said he got in the boat with the disciples and the wind died down. The storm just saw Jesus and knew what his will was for the storm. All right. Here they immediately reached the shore where they were headed under Jesus' guidance and protection. Now let's go to verse 22. That pretty much completes the part about the walking on the water, and it almost seems almost anticlimactical. We get one sentence out of that. We get the lead up to it where the disciples get themselves into a situation where they're fearful because they get out in this storm and they see Jesus. They think he's a ghost. Wow, we're scared. And so Jesus calms that down. He sees them walking on the water, and he gets with them to calm them down, assuage their fears, and he gets in the boat and the storm dies down. It's pretty eventful, not uneventful. It's a big deal what just happened there. So it brings us to verses 22. So let me read verse 22 to 24. The next day, the crowd that stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone up, but that they had gone away alone. The disciples had gone away alone. In 23, then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Verse 24, once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boat and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. Verse 22, the crowd knew the boat left, and guess who was not in it? Guess, Jesus. More people showed up when the feeding miracle had happened, looking for another meal, I guess, or another miracle. I'm sure, no question about that. I don't believe that's why they're following him. They haven't quite gotten to the point where they're seeing the whole picture. In verse 24, when they figured out Jesus was gone, they had a good idea where he was, and they went looking for him. Remember, at the end of the feeding miracle, Jesus had said he slipped away because they were going to take him by force to be their king. Nobody in this group is aware of any walking in the water miracle. So they didn't see it, is what I'm trying to say. They may hear about it, but they didn't see it. This group that saw and heard about the feeding miracle want another sign when they finally catch up with him. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for studying with me.